Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Berger, president of Oxford, and thanks for attending our third session in our Zero Trust presentation today. On deck, we've got Mark Riley. He's been a principal architect here at Oxford for 7 years. And I always enjoy introducing Mark because we've worked together on and off for 28 years. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, Mark and I in an earlier life were contracted to build a course for Microsoft executives in the early 90s called The Business Value of the Internet. Because a lot of senior Microsoft management in the early 90s weren't convinced that Microsoft could make a buck off of it. So here we are a few years later, a very small contributor to the initial cultural change at Microsoft that gets us to the platform we're talking about today. Mark has had key roles in the rollout of secure mobile solutions in a number of enterprises, including being a project lead for that effort internally at Microsoft. But Mark's talents extend into identity management, identity governance, modern authentication, privileged access, and other areas that are all part of a zero trust strategy. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Mark.
All right, well, thank you, Steve. That was a very nice introduction. Yeah, Steve and I have worked together for a long time. When I think back, what I think back to is the Wi-Fi thing we did for Microsoft with 1 megabit Wi-Fi's laptops in a bar in Seattle, along with a printed up piece of paper with URLs on it, because links, people didn't even understand links at the time. So yes, I'm old. Anyway, so let's go. We're going to talk future state of identity and security, and what I'm going to dig into after Sarah's presentation and Frank's presentation is kind of tying the Microsoft story together. So we're going to look at, we're an identity shop, identity and security shop. Identity is key to us. It's key to the zero trust proposition as well, that the identity, as Alex Simon says, is the new control plane, that we're no longer using the perimeter for that the identity is our starting point. And so that's going to be my starting point today. We'll talk about how zero trust in Microsoft works. One of the things we're going to look at is identity protection. Take a quick look also at cloud app security, Microsoft's app Proxy, and then dig into conditional access a little deeper, where we start to bring these things together into a true zero trust environment, platform, framework, whatever terms you want to use for this. And in that, I want to talk a little bit about policies, some thoughts about how you might approach conditional access and zero trust, some gotchas to look out for so you don't get too far down the rabbit holes. How this fits into our larger strategic goals with passwordless, things like that. And what do we get from it? What are the wins? Why would we want to do this aside from the obvious? Everybody and his brother talks about all the changes that have happened since March with the pandemic and all the people working from home and all those things. So zero trust is top of mind for people. So identity protection is a really useful piece in the zero trust, because as we said, if we make identity the core of our authentication and authorization, then we need to protect that. Right? Put all our eggs in one basket and watch that basket very carefully. Well, identity is core to this, so we need to know what's going on with the identity. A core principle, as Sarah talked about, was to create a strong identity, a single identity, drive to a single identity. It's really difficult to get there. We know that, we deal with it real world every day. But identity protection gives us, through the power of the cloud and the number of authorizations that Microsoft does in the cloud, gives us a lot of information about how our identity is being used, risks to that identity, and allows us to take those signals about the risk to the identity and apply those to our conditional access, to our trust, as we build up the trust along our zero trust model. So things that identity protection looks for is things like atypical travel. Like, this is the first time we've ever seen this user log on from Peru, for example, right? We might raise that might raise the level a bit. All of these things that we talk about in zero trust in the Microsoft space are based on two core principles. One is risk. We're looking at risk, and we tend to build that risk as we go through the model. And when we hit an inflection point of that risk, then that triggers something. Maybe we'll ask for a change, a step up off, change the password, block the user, whatever it might happen to be. We'll talk about those in more detail. Identity protection also looks at where the identity authentication event is coming from. If that's a bad known IP, identity protection will help black hole that, do some smart lockouts. I get locked out frequently in my account. If I go in and look at the audit logs in Azure, you see that my account gets locked out frequently. I never see it because it realizes my IP, because these days I'm always at home, my IP it lets through because it knows that's been frequently used for normal authentication. IPs that are other than that are given a bit more introspection, a bit more look at it, not really introspection, but inspection. Any other anomalies? So there's a whole list of them. A different browser coming in through Tor, any of those things can tend to raise the identity risk level. And once the risk level is raised, then we can react to that within conditional access and use that as a signal for zero trust. Another big piece of zero trust is cloud app security, because as we move to people working from wherever and using applications that don't sit within our perimeter, we lose the ability to affect what people can do to those. We can't monitor them. We don't have an IDP sitting out there looking at all the calls that are being made to an application. So what we need is a cloud app security broker that talks to those hosted applications and tells them what we would like to do with data when it's presented in a certain way. And for those use, for most of these applications that we deal with, there's a small subset of applications that allow APIs for us to tell them what we'd like to do. If you get this particular document, reject it. If you get something that isn't protected, reject it. If someone is downloading a ton of data, please let me know. If someone's uploading a ton of data, let me know. Or if someone is changing the file extensions of files, which is a real indicator of a ransomware attack, then raise the alerts. So what cloud app security does is not so much from a zero trust perspective, but it's an important component of it because we're trusting those applications to do what we can't manage anymore because we don't have that perimeter and the fine-grained control over the packets that are being sent between the two. So it's an important component. Application proxy is also another important piece that allows us to provide access for our users. This allows us to also apply the policies that we create in conditional access, but allows us to grant users access to applications on premises when those users are not on premises. So wherever I might happen to be, I can still connect back, access those applications on premises using whatever mechanism we used in the past. So I may be using NTLM authentication on this application, or I may be using host header authentication on this application. I can still use those applications from outside based on the level of trust that I build up in all of my applications through the conditional access. So let's dig into that. Conditional access, as I say, really kind of ties the room together, the whole concept from the talk here. And thanks to the Big Lebowski for that. So in the general sense, as Sarah talked about, zero trust model has some real solid concepts behind it. People know what zero trust is. It's based on some solid rules, user risk being one of them, device risk being another, right? You have to evaluate it. Do you trust the user, right? The user has a username and password, but is that enough? With phishing, it's easy, relatively easy for people to get passwords if they're smart about it, if we're in a hurry, if we think, well, yeah, that's a trusted person and I'll just give them the password. One of the things that makes passwords bad, right? Is the user coming from a place that is impossible? Did they log on from Seattle 20 minutes ago and now they're in New Orleans? Well, that's impossible travel. It can happen through a VPN or some other remote access, but it's impossible travel. So again, we raise the limit a little bit. We look at the devices. Are the devices trusted? Are they managed? Are they joined to a domain? If they're joined to a domain, we expect through policy objects, some management system is applied. We have a level of trust if it's in a domain, right? Is it infected? When's the last time it's been inspected? How clean is this machine? What does it look like? Right. The next step is to make a decision based on on that criteria, right? So we see, oh, there is some risk either on the device or the user side. Well, we can call out for some orchestration to say, let's go resolve that risk, whatever the risk might be. Maybe the user's password's been compromised and we want them to reset it. Maybe we're just not certain. Maybe the risk level's medium. At high, we block them, but at medium, we say, oh, okay, let's just throw MFA on top of that. So we can do that. And then once we make that decision, we provide the remediation immediately, not a call to a help desk. We just go out, we do the remediation, maybe the user resets their password. Then we get access to what we're looking for, whether that's documents, to get into an application, might even be a legacy app, right? Might have to do some LDAP authentication once we get inside the app proxy, right? That application might reach out and do an authentication for us to LDAP or something. And then we might also have some networking components in here. We might be using this process, not necessarily conditional access, but this process to evaluate whether or not a user can transition to another network, another internal network, another maybe more secure network. But the biggest thing about this is that we're treating users. Notice there aren't a number of paths in here. It's pretty much one path in, one path out. We don't have a lot of decision points to make. There are a lot of decisions in there, but everything goes through this single engine. So we're able to accumulate those signals and respond to them properly. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch up as we go to the next one. I'll get myself out of here so we can see a little closer view here. So the same model, but let's take a look at it with Microsoft tools in this setting. So when we're looking at user risk, right, that's Azure Identity Protection, as I talked about. We also get signals from ATP, well, known as ATP. As Frank said, all these things are getting new names. But the Advanced Threat Protection on premises, that is a UBA component, which looks at user behavior and will trigger risk alerts if the user is doing things out of the norm. So if normally I log on to a certain set of boxes, I do certain things, I reach their servers, and I get home at 5 o'clock because my life is good. And all of a sudden I'm logged on at 2 o'clock in the morning from my desk, from someone else's machine, all these things, UEBA says, hey, that's a problem, throws the risk level up to identity protection. Identity protection can then tell conditional access, oh, whoa, we're a little worried about this, so maybe you do something on this. Same thing with the machine risk, right? Endpoint protection, knee Intune, right? Or a partner MDM, right? Conditional access, there's currently AirWatch has a trial in progress. VMware has trial in progress with Intune and AirWatch so that AirWatch can bring their signals in and provide those signals for conditional access. And Defender, ATP or endpoint protection, the name since Ignite, I guess, also provides signal, is the device clean? Has the device been checked for virus, for malware, any of those types of risks? Then when we evaluate that policy, we decide that there is remediation required, and we can call out to either MFA, if that's what we want, or self-service password reset, which also tends to involve an MFA function. So we get better bang for the buck. We just say, just go ahead and change the password. And then we get access to each of these things from conditional access. So same model from the slide we saw before. I'm still waving my hands, even though you can't see me. Same access, same model from before, not a whole lot different. Some interesting components here, though, is when we get into some of these Microsoft applications, we can do some fine-grained control of access. So in the case of SharePoint and Exchange Online, we can restrict whether users can actually download files. We can allow users to see mail or see their SharePoint sites, but not pull files off if they're on a machine we don't trust, or something along those lines. So all these things build, right? And we can access those legacy apps through the app proxy, right? Documents can be protected through AIP. AIP can also work with the cloud security broker to protect apps or protect content and documents as they leave the organization and go to other cloud providers. Now, as Frank said in another presentation, I'm leveraging this slide, and some of the nomenclature may be a little old. I tried to update it, but as Frank mentioned in an earlier presentation using this slide, you may have already won if you own these components. So a lot of the things that are required to do Zero Trust are already built in to the Microsoft stack. We don't have to go out and get those third-party components as Frank talked about in his talk. The pieces are there for us, and we can go ahead and use them. We of course may have to up level to get some additional functionality. Something like identity protection still works when you're at a lower level. You just don't get the level of detail, the fidelity out of those signals that you do when you up level to an E5 or something like that. Continuous authentication is another piece of Zero Trust, another piece that is being applied, some of it through conditional access, some of it through other components. We're still working to get there. Continuous authentication is not a thing yet. We're still working. Outlook, in one hand, always authenticates because it's a web request, just the way it works. Continuous authentication, if we look at bindings for SSL, that's a continuous authentication. We check that binding to make sure that that's the proper connection that we're working with every time we get a connection, so that improves SSL security. Encrypted machine authenticators, right? The ability to do things through having certificates encrypted on the device that we unlock with a biometric that we send on, right? Hello, Windows, hello. User location, that's something we're working on. I have an issue with using networks too much. We'll talk a little bit about that. Location is another more interesting piece. Some of the online gambling are using it based on laws in certain states because you have to be in certain locations. Multiple layers of authentication, right? That's what Zero Trust is. We authenticate the user, we authenticate the machine, we authenticate the action, right? Each of those, the session, all of those are done. And then we want to try and reduce user sign-on authentication frequency, right? CISO for Microsoft says he wants people to MFA every time. And that sounds complex, but it's not if you do it right. You MFA every time, but if the MFA is hidden from you, then you get a good balance of security and usability. And the way we accomplish that, using things like Windows Hello or FIDO, those types of authentication. So how do you verify? If we say Zero Trust, who do you trust? What do you trust? Well, if we want to verify the user, we up-level that with MFA. We want to verify the machine. Well, is it managed? We get an indication back through claims during the authentication that it's managed. We can put certificates on it to show it's managed. We can hide certificates in the TPM, the Trusted Protection module, which we're able then to pull out securely and provide for authentication. Again, Windows Hello. Bind the SSL session using TLS, talked about that a little bit. And passwordless. Passwordless is really one of the big risks we have in trust, is trusting the user authentication and password. As we get rid of passwords, we improve the level of trust. And for that component of authentication, for that user, and we move, frankly, to MFA every time when we get to passwords. So some of the policies I wanted to talk about with Zero Trust. First of all, one of the most important things, and this comes from working with people who have done these, is reduce exceptions, right? And exceptions are the bane of any policy type of setup, and we all know that in IT. But try and reduce the exceptions. And what I mean by that is don't set up one rule for people on one network, another rule for people on another network, or one rule for people in a certain state and one rule for people in another location, right? Reduce those exceptions. The more you make people the same, the more reasonable that plan will be. The easier it is to explain to people, the easier it is to explain to your high-risk users, particularly, why they need to comply with these policies. Also, don't make the inverse of a negative signal positive. And what I mean about this is it's okay to think about, and this is kind of my thoughts on networks, it's okay to think about, I don't want to allow somebody come in from an unknown network. right? You may say that for some high security things, or I'm going to ask for MFA on an unknown network. Those are good policies. The inverse of that is not as good, to say, oh, well, I just won't ask for MFA on a known network, right? So it's kind of a nomenclature or a positional thing, not so much a hard and fast rule, because I'm saying don't do this, but do the other thing. But it's more of a mindset to think about. We want to keep things consistent, and we don't want to allow things, particularly because of a certain item. We may block things because of a certain item, but we don't want to make that decision necessarily to allow. The negative shouldn't override the positive, if that makes sense. Hope it does. Use the properties which you know to build trust. So look at all of the things that are coming in, build that stack of trust until we're confident. And if we're not, then throw an MFA on there or do something else. As you're building out these conditional access policies, make use of the audit capability. Right now in conditional access, we're able to see what the effect would be without actually blocking people. So turn on the audit capability, you'll see who gets blocked, you'll see who doesn't get blocked. You can help the users who are getting blocked fix it. These are great things for fixing things like legacy authentication and those kinds of pieces. Right, so how do we integrate this with all the other things we've got going on? Fortunately, or unfortunately, but fortunately, it builds on the things we're trying to do now, right? So zero trust identity architecture, right? We need to get that strong identity. We need to get some governance around it. We need to make sure that that identity is protected, that we're monitoring it, and that it's being used properly. MFA, as everybody's heard about MFA, we don't even talk about that. Modernize the SOC, right? We're starting to bring these things together, all these signals. This is the story in Microsoft, is we get all these signals, whether it's from the identity logon, it's from ATP on premises. Oops, I'm sorry, I hit my keyboard. ATP on premises that tells us something up, or CASB says this user's downloading a ton of data. Well, then maybe we tell identity protection they're at high risk. Let's block them, make them log on. All that stuff comes together. You want to roll it up into the SOC, but you need tools so that the hunters in the SOC aren't overwhelmed, right? So up level that, add some AI, ML, whatever it happens to be. Strengthen your administration, right? PIM helps us with that. Some form of access management is required for that administration. And update your resources, right? Modern authentication. The more we can bring things into modern authentication, then we get all of these benefits of conditional access, of zero trust, each of those things. And network transformation. I'm not going to talk in depth about this, but the big thing to think about is most of your users right now are probably coming from the internet. You probably should treat all your users like they're coming from the internet. Again, makes it easier. Internet first stuff then for users. That is, when I log on, my connections to the internet. Anything inside the corp, I have to come hairpin back around to get into the corp for access. All right. So what does all this give us? Well, zero trust gives us much better granularity, right? In the old days, it's just VPN. VPN's all or nothing, so you didn't give it to everybody, right? You limited access only people who needed VPN because that was just a door. Once you go through VPN, you had access to anything on the network as if you were sitting on the network inside your perimeter, inside your walls, right? There was no auth N, well, it was all auth N, no auth Z, right? It is limited to a subset of users. This democratizes access. There's no reason people can't have access if you can make the trust about unknown machines, identities that come from outside, federation, all of those things. And it all elevates security, right? Bringing in the device signals, all of that gives us more information, gives us more detail, and provides better security for our organization. So thanks for your time. That is my time. In another 5 minutes, I guess, we've got the roundtable coming up with Steve. That session will not be recorded, so please don't miss it. And call back to Sarah's slides, the Zero Trust Maturity Model, and our Zero Trust Questionnaire. Thanks again for your time. Hope to see you in the next session.